So today I'd like to talk about John Adams because I feel like I knew a little bit less about him compared to a few of our other founding fathers, such as George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. So I wanted to do a little bit of research about John Adams just to see exactly what he contributed to the overall American independence. So I began to look at John Adams and the struggles and decisions he faced during the steps to America's independence. And I think it's very important to start back at the beginning when John Adams was first introduced to the radical movement and where exactly he stood on the issue. So, back in the 1770s, Adams was actually a highly successful lawyer in America. Not only was he highly successful, but he was also very busy because of this. And this was largely due to the fact that Adams was the lawyer chosen to defend the British soldiers who were charged for the Boston Massacre. All of the British soldiers were declared not guilty and ended up not going to jail thanks to his work for the British side. He has always been involved in politics in one way or another. When he wasn't in the courtroom, he actually spent his time publishing essays in newspapers in Massachusetts about legal, political, and even social issues. So after the British attempted to tax the colonies during the Stamp Act of 1765, the colonies began to immediately protest the British policies. Adams was actually on the British side at this time. He did not join them, his fellow colonists, but instead determined that the British government was actually making decisions for the better of the American people. That's what he truly believed, so he was a little naive at the time. But he believed that the Stamp Act was not a decision that the British made to cause harm or to take advantage of the colonies. He also believed that the radicals in the colonies had a hidden agenda, and he distrusted them for all of their efforts and what they were currently trying to work for because he thought they had a hidden agenda going against the British, which really they did. But so besides the hidden agenda, among the radicals, he even feared his own cousin. His name was Samuel Adams, and he distrusted basically anybody that was going against the British, didn't believe in what the British were going for, because at that time he truly believed that the British were making all of their decisions based on trying to help the colonies and trying to boost their economy and work for the overall success of New England. So, shortly after the protests began, the British policies were enacted, including the Stamp Act. Adams did end up assisting in the protest movement, so he did make a shift over to the radicals, and this was because of a few things here. So he actually began to write newspapers for the radical movement, and he started creating propaganda pieces to try to persuade others to follow in the same footsteps as he did. One of his most famous and powerful essays was Thoughts on Government, and this was all in an attempt to persuade those who weren't already following the radical movement to do so, and to join to join in with the colonies and to fight against the British. So over time, when Britain remained persistent to tax the colonies, even after the Stamp Act, Adams began to really see the truth and really started to see what he was keeping himself blind to before. And his trust for the radicals grew, and he soon understood why and what they wanted to fight for in the beginning. So he was starting to see that he was starting to see exactly what they were talking about before when he thought they had a hidden agenda. So he was starting to actually be a part of that hidden agenda. And by 1774, Adams was actually a full-fledged radical. He was selected to go to Philadelphia with 3 other delegates from Massachusetts to be a part of the First Continental Congress. He was actually the one to nominate George Washington as General of the Continental Army, and he was also re-elected to the Second Continental Congress the following year in 1775. By June of 1776, the Second Continental Congress appointed John Adams to be a part of the preparation of the Declaration of Independence. Along with John Adams included Thomas Jefferson and even Benjamin Franklin. So it's very obvious why the Continental Congress chose John Adams to be on the board for the creation of the Declaration of Independence. He was actually more involved politically than any other man in the colonies at that time. He served on 90 different committees, and he was also the chair of 20 of those committees. He also served as the head of the Congressional Committee that oversaw the operations of the Continental Army. At the beginning, he did not want to wage war on Britain, but then he also started to see that it was necessary in order to accomplish the American independence. So his decisions to be actively involved in the Continental Army showed that he eventually saw no other way for America to win. And by the time of the Second Continental Congress, Adams was fully convinced that a strong army was necessary to defend the colonies against the British. He made this very clear in his statement, "Powder and artillery are the most efficacious, sure, and infallible measure we can adopt." He even went as far to reach out to Britain's enemies to help win the war. He personally reached out to Spain and France as allies, hoping that they would shortly, which they did, supply weapons for the war against the British. So, naturally, certain individuals did oppose Adams' strong approach, especially when it came to waging war. One individual in particular was John Dickinson. John Dickinson argued against Adams, saying that a war against the British would only lead to disaster for New England. However, Adams publicly challenged him during a Congress session, and after the two men publicly revealed their disagreements, Dickinson pulled a few strings behind the scenes, trying to go behind John Adams' back and to avoid war. So Dickinson took it upon himself to petition the British Parliament with the colonists' grievances. And Adams actually reacted by speaking out in the Continental Congress during a session and reminding them of the recent battles that occurred against the British. He talked about the battles of Lexington, the battles of Concord, and Bunker Hill, and how brutal they were and how the British showed no mercy against the New England colonists. At that time, Adams really pushed to Congress to establish a standing army and to kind of fast forward the process of breaking off from the British government and how important it was, how they were really in that state of war and they had no choice at that time. So even though this is a very basic story of John Adams and how he initially started up in the shaping of the American Republic, it's still very important, especially just to see that in the beginning he was so loyal and so passionate and trustworthy when it came to the British government, and he may have been distrustful to the radical and revolutionary movement in the beginning, but it didn't take long for him to really be able to open his eyes and change his opinion about the entire radical movement. Soon he became very passionate for the revolutionary movement and all that it stood for. Even though he changed sides through public opinion and pressure, so it didn't take a whole lot for him to change his opinions, he also changed the opinions of many others, and that's really what is very beneficial for the Declaration of Independence. It's very obvious that he worked hard for what he believed in, and he pushed his way to the heart of the movement. And by the end of the American Revolution, John Adams earned the reputation of a patriot by all that followed him and believed in him. He faced the challenges against the British government fearlessly, and all of his actions on the 90 different committees that he served and published essays expressed his feelings toward the American Revolution. He went above and beyond all for the American freedoms we know today. And as John Adams said in 1776, these colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states.